And it says setting up. YouTube seems to be done.
It doesn't matter. His hair is fine.
Okay, YouTube is fine. YouTube is on. I'm just gonna send. When I switch it off from my side, that's why you're getting that both the echo, because it's live on Facebook. I mean on YouTube now. Okay, so we're ready to go. We are definitely live now on YouTube. Welcome everybody. The meeting.
Hardy does.
So I've just shared the YouTube link on the screen now for everybody to be able to share. Kindly share it widely as much as possible. So just give me 2 minutes to just close things here and then we start.
Mama, can you stop being aggressive now?
Okay, welcome everyone. We can hear background noise. I don't know where it's coming from. Can I request everyone please to just be aware that we are live on on YouTube. We couldn't successfully get live on Alisa, can you please mute your mic? We couldn't be live on Facebook, but we are live on YouTube today. I've shared the link and we can please share it widely. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Nikki. Welcome in this space and thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And I'd like to say welcome to Fatima. We have been in these conversations differently. So good to see you here again. Like we have said, beloveds, this is a feminist conversation that we are having as sisters to share our imagination. My name is Figile Vilagazi. We are broadcasting live today from the Lord's Love Rebels Feminist Collective. So I'm not alone in this space. There's a couple of us also that are coming from that space. We have been imagining a lot during COVID-19 as a pandemic, thinking about feminist organizing, feminist struggles, feminist joys, and feminist building to say COVID-19 has hit us very hard. But I don't want to go a lot before I also welcome everyone that has joined us in the Zoom room. There's a couple of us, and I think maybe if everyone wants to say hello, and greet before we start, we can open the floor for that. Thank you so much. Please feel free to open your mic if you want to show your video just to say hi to all of us.
Hi, everybody. Nikki here.
I don't know if I should call in names or people. We can see you here, Fatima. Would you like to say hello? Your mic is muted.
Hi, good afternoon. My apologies. I'm doing this from my phone and my finger is too big. It presses all the buttons at the same time. So it's lovely to be part of this conversation. I see some friends and sisters in the room. I'm looking forward to being here. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hi, John.
Hi, Heidi, I see you here. Would you like to say hello?
Hello, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here. I expected more people, maybe they're still coming, but I'm very honored to be here today and to be part of the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Heidi was really helpful as part of the media team that has been helping us to do the poster that you've seen around. We truly appreciate your lovely work. Thank you so much, Heidi.
Thank you.
I see Jane, you are here. Would you like to say hello? Jane, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm also trying on my phone and I'm useless in it. Yes, thanks, Figile. It's great to be here and to see people been saying hi to Nikki on the side. I won't be able to be long because I'm expecting my granddaughter, but I'm hanging in while we can and I'll come back to recording. But thanks for the space.
Thank you so much. You're welcome, Jane. I think Nikki has said hello already. Palisa, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm in the car and I just dropped off my younger brother at a birthday party for 1 hour or so. Thank you so much for the space.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And Unati, I see you're also in the room. Would you like to greet? We can't hear your voice. I don't know. Thokozani.
Hello, Thokozani Bafetu, Thokozani Ndlondlo, Thokozani Bogogo. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy for us to finally have these conversations, and hopefully we can finally direct it to where we are, which is I've always say this all the time, and I know I'm always saying this, but I think it's something that we always need to have it in our consciousness that we are in this great dark continent called Alkebulan or Africa. And so we really need to feminist and bring economy back to the continent, and the economy needs to be fed and fueled by the people of this continent. For so long, it's always been about colonizers and what they think about us and what they feel about us. It's about time that we start to feel ourselves in the space and feel with resources and money, actually. So I'm happy to see people that are dealing with funding in the room, and we can have this conversation moving forward.
Thokozani Gogo, siyabonga kakhulu bukhona bakho. Enkosi. Vanessa, I see you here. Would you like to say hello? I know that there is struggle with the internet in some places because of load shedding. And I know Cape Town is one of the places at the moment because we are expecting Pindi to join us from where she is sitting, and there's a problem with the internet. So I don't know if you can hear us, V, but if you can, you're welcome to greet. Otherwise, when you can, please do come and greet. So Pindi is not here, and she did say that she is having a struggle with the internet. I will try and see if I can get hold of her via WhatsApp. I mean, the problem is load shedding. She's been trying. So give me just 1 minute to get hold of her, and then we will start. She's one of the people that said, I'm willing to come and speak. Hi, Pindi, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so sorry about this thing, internet. I don't know where that.
No, that's.
Yeah, with the internet and
I know, that's fine. I'm just calling to check. We are actually live, ne? We are on the session.
Yeah.
Everyone is just greeting. So I was checking if it's okay to bring you here this way in the WhatsApp.
Okay. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, all right. So you are on then. You can just greet everybody. Can I just check in? Can everyone hear Upindi?
Hi, everyone.
Yes, okay.
Hello.
Hello. So that
Can
was,
you hear me?
I'm not getting any feedback. If you can hear Pindi, please just maybe click a hand or say, yes, I can hear Pindi.
It's quite clear, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so you are audible, Pindi. Just say hello and then we will start the session.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry that you can't see my face. I can't be live on Facebook there. But yeah, thank you for connecting with Sigile.
You are welcome. We are actually live on YouTube. We couldn't succeed on Facebook.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's fine. We are here. So anyway, this is where we are. This is what we are meeting about. Like I said, we are broadcasting live from the Lord's Love Rebels Feminist Collective. The Lord's Love Rebels is a feminist collective that really has come together during COVID-19 pandemic, mainly because of the challenges of what we are all faced with as feminists in South Africa, trying to navigate the terrain of movement building and really making sense of the pandemic itself. And we have been having these conversations, also the imagination, of what it means to build feminist futures, because COVID-19 has shown us that something has changed. Something has changed, and that thing has actually changed possibly permanently. We are not going to be able to go back to a normality that we had before COVID-19 as a pandemic. A lot of things that we used to know are collapsing in front of our eyes. We can see when you open television, we can see when even the way that we live, we are all under lockdown as we're having these conversations as feminists. So much has been taken away from us in terms of what we know as normality. But there's also opportunities that come with that. These are opportunities of imagination, opportunities of building something that is new. And I think as feminist bodies who are walking through this journey, this is what brings us into this conversation. Because one of the challenges that we have picked up is also the conversation about capital. We live in a capitalist society, and the capitalist society has taught us that we need to wake up in the morning, go to work, earn a salary, in order to be able to make a livelihood, in order to be able to put food on the table, in order to be able to take our children to school, also in order to be able to organize ourselves, either as NGOs, civil society organizations, to wage a collective struggles around issues of justice, economic, social justices, and so on. But and I think there's a manner also in which that kind of organizing has been under the capitalist system, because it requires that you have certain systems in place. But when the pandemic hit, all of us were brought into this chaos. And I think we all felt it in the different spaces where normality is not normality anymore. Homes have become centers of learning, homes have become centers of work. We are now even sitting at work, some of us, we have children that we have to take care of at the same time. We have to feed at the same time. We have to, for people like us, for instance, because I work at a university, you still have to conduct a lecture, and you still have to be an activist. All is happening in one space. So the systems that we know have really changed. Even the imagination of what is money, because it's happening at where we are faced with high levels of unemployment and hunger and starvation and destitution. And even in civil society organizations, because we're also organizing through money, which is in the form of funding. But what we also have seen is that we have each other. But anyway, so my role today is just to facilitate this conversation. We have time scheduled until 4 o'clock to have the conversation, so I'm not going to waste any time. because we have requested the speakers that are here to share with us from where you are sitting, just what has been the feeling for you? What are your thoughts around rebuilding feminist futures in view of this system that is collapsing or seems to be collapsing in front of our eyes, and the role of money and resourcing in terms of funding radical feminist organizing, particularly radical, because radical means that you're organizing in a certain way, and it feels in a particular way. So it's very, very few people that want to come closer to radical forms of organizing when we are going through a pandemic, because it feels like many things. So the floor is open, and I don't know if we should start with Pindi, perhaps because of the connection there. If it's okay with you, just bring you in, Pindi, and then maybe we'll bring in Nikki, and then thereafter we'll bring you in Fatima. Just to reflect on this question. Yeah, over to you, Pindi.
Okay, thank you for inviting me into this conversation. Yeah, I think this is a very, very difficult time and a hard time for many of us, moreover as women, I'm sure as men, but unfortunately, most of the time women happen to be the ones that, carry the burden of trying to keep things to normal, having to hold so many roles within the household. And right now, as you said earlier, the role mostly of, being a teacher, it's mostly done by a woman, even in homes where there's a father. So women have to do all these multiple roles of being a worker, of sitting on Zoom calls for endless hours, whilst you still have to be helping, children with schoolwork, making sure that they eat, trying to make sure that the household, everything. So it is a bit overwhelming, really, and it is the time where sisterhood is really something that is really required, support and just holding each other. But I also realize that even with wanting to hold each other and support each other, it's also a bit overwhelming doing it, the way we're doing it online, visually and all of that. So sometimes, there's that longing of just being in space, physically with people, because that has a different kind of feeling. And that takes me back to the kind of work that, we do in NGOs, for example, that usually works on a kind of face-to-face kind of work. So if you're working in communities where not everyone is going to be able to, be on a Zoom call or have resources to participate online, even on WhatsApp, it's really not the same, so it is a time that requires us to really think hard how we're going to move forward in how we're doing things. And what are those things? For example, right now, a lot of people, a lot of women especially, have lost jobs, are struggling with income. So there's that reliance on these food parcels that they give, which is not something that's going to really change anyone's life. It might, change the situation right now, but it's not a sustainable thing. It's not, so it calls on us to really think differently, about our survival, about being able to feed our families. If we're going to be losing jobs, if we're not going to be able to go to communities and do the work that we were doing before. For example, it might mean funding might have to come down. So the question that I constantly have in my head is, I constantly wonder if, for example, donors, feminist donors, are they thinking about these things? I mean, have the ways of reporting and delivering, have those been adjusted during this time? Because the ways of how as community workers were expected to report on the work that we are doing, the numbers, that has changed. It's not going to work like that anymore, you know? And even though before COVID, for example, the issues around how we measure change, I think when we're looking in how change happens in a feminist way, it's impossible to measure that in a one-year program, two-year program. Change happens over time because it's a number of things that contribute for the change to happen, if it happens at all. And it might not happen maybe at the time where, for example, the funding that we might have received to do the work that donors are expected us to do. And therefore, it doesn't look like, work has been done. And that sometimes kind of, put pressures on the people that are delivering the work in NGOs, for example. And I'll talk about my experience, for example, when I worked in a feminist organization at FEW, where, the issues, there's so many issues in the groups that you're dealing with that you need to start right from the beginning, just to understand the background of this person, where they come from, what are other issues that, are affecting them before we can even talk about how do we teach you about your rights, how do you access your rights, and so on and so forth. So there's so many things, there's family issues, there's all of these things. And you look at the time that we're in now, where people are really also forced sometimes to stay with the very same families that might not be so good for them. I don't know what's the right word, right? But unfortunately, people, because that's what they have, and they have to be in that space. So right now, there's a lot of issues around mental health that I think as feminist organizations, we might not necessarily even have resources to deal with. And those are important. Those are really important right now because when we look at the current time, anxieties are very high. For most people in families, from children who have to find themselves being at home all the time, to parents that have to sit with children throughout the day. There's no break. There's families that are infected and so on and so forth. And I might be a bit all over, but that's the kind of space that we are right now, where you have to try and hold everything together. So I think for me, I would want us, like you said earlier, to really know that we are not going, even if we go back to, level 1 or level 0, but things are not going to be, the same ever. And what does that mean? How do we, reimagine differently? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pindi, for those beautiful words. Just at the center of your imagination, if you were to ask for one thing or two that can be done anew, given your experience also, from where you are sitting, because you have led organizations, you have had relationships with processes of funding and money and so on. So if we were to do things differently, in this reality that something is not going to change because you're saying we must accept it, what would we need to do to be able to resource this rebuilding process?
I think for me, mental health is the biggest one. Wellness programs, because that will also assist the leaders themselves, so the people that are supposed to be leading spaces, organizations, or other people. But if and they have to carry a lot of pressure themselves, and most of the time there's never spaces where they can, go and talk to someone, and the space of just being free to talk about your own issues. So most of the time you have to put your own issues at the back and focus on everybody else. And that's why you find that a lot of people, they get burned out, people get depression, people get all sorts of health-related illnesses because they have to be, superheroes of holding spaces and forget about themselves because they have to think of everybody else. So for me, I think resources that focuses on that, because you can't build something when you are not, your own foundation is not strong, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pindi. We will come back later on. I would like you to think about what I'm about to bring in, Nikki, but I'd like you to think about that question that you're saying we must resource mental health and space conversation, because conversation heals us. To think about how do we do that when the system that is financial itself, which is the capitalist system, is collapsing. So how does the resourcing look like? Is this resourcing money? Is it something else? But think about it. We'll come back to that. Over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Fikile. I think for me, the crisis of the pandemic has really showed us that if there is ever a time for radical change, it's now. That we don't have, I think, as feminists, the luxury of the sort of slow change processes we always talk about. The other day I was on a webinar with Tendai Chume, and she said we need to be prepared to be remade. And it really made me think about this reimagining of a new way, because the pandemic has shown us our, in our faces, inequality, power in massive ways. And although we talk about the capitalist system falling apart or collapsing, but we do know that it's very resilient. It chops and changes. It has within itself the way, the way the power to change. And so I think as feminists, we really need to think about what is the radical opportunities now that we can take hold of. And there are many opportunities that we have now. And just on something you spoke about earlier when you opened up, when we talk about how we've actually seen collective ways of working, collective solidarity, cross, silo solidarity during this time, particularly in the feminist movements and women's rights movements. I think now's the time. It's the pandemic has given us the impetus, and so now it's time for us to move forward. And I just also, and I hope we will get the opportunity to speak a little bit later on about what Pindi's raising, such an important thing about healing, because I do think that that's a big part of our reimagining needs to talk about healing and how, as those who are founders come to the party to resource organizations' healing and resilience in new and innovative ways, which perhaps they haven't done before. But I feel like the time is now, and if there ever is a time to be for radical rethinking, it's now.
Thanks, Nikki. Fatima?
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Good afternoon, sisters. First, let me start off by saying that I've had an absolutely brutal week. It's been one of those weeks I'm feeling very low energy, and I feel like my thoughts are scattered all over the place. So I know that you're never supposed to make apologies before you start talking because you give your power away. But I'm going to assume in the safety of a feminist space, I don't need that power for this conversation. So bear with me if it's all over the place. But let me start off by saying, Fikili, maybe controversially, that I don't think capitalism is anywhere near dying. Yeah? So what I want us to think back to 2008 when the housing market started collapsing in the USA, and we all thought this is it because the housing market collapsed, and then there was a ripple effect all over the world. South Africa, by I think by fluke of history, was well insulated, so we didn't really feel the brunt of that collapse. But I remember feeling very excited at that moment as a left feminist because I thought the moment is here, capitalism is revealing itself for the fast that it is, and now the world can see what it is. But I think to our collective shock and horror, not only did capitalism survive, right before our eyes, it consolidated itself, and then it used the same system to actually get a lot. The capitalists got a lot out of that crisis. They consolidated their position. They got state bailout at the expense of the poor. So the reason I'm referencing 2008 is my feeling is that we're going into a very similar historical moment. And so even though 2008 wasn't big on our horizon as South Africans, I think there's something in that moment that we can learn from it to see what lessons we need to like. So when I think about 2008, the big failure on the part of us as the left was to interpret the moment and to reveal it for what it is. So I think the important thing for me is to understand that history doesn't have objective meaning. Events unfold before our eyes, and often it's the people with power and voice who give meaning to history. They interpret it and say, this is actually what's happening. And when I think about 2008, the big failure was for us to say, actually, this is what's happening. This is capitalism revealing itself. And so, again, I think we find ourselves in a moment where we are so busy, invested in keeping people alive, rightly so, that there's not a lot of work going into shaping the narrative of what COVID is and what it isn't. So I think for me, the first thing is for us to refute the notion that COVID is a health crisis. For me, COVID is a global political economic crisis that manifesting in health terms. It's just an accident of nature that this is how it's manifesting. So that's the first point for me. The second one is I think we should also, from an historical perspective, recognize that all moments of great societal upheaval present an opportunity to either two things are going to happen. Whatever existed before will be that status quo will be consolidated and reproduced, but there's a tremendous opportunity to disrupt and to change the course of history. And it's not my imagination. If you look at the end of slavery, the end of colonialism, if you look at the end of apartheid in our country, there were evidence that the movements who were strategically positioned were able to wedge in at exactly that moment and shift things in different directions. So I want to start off by talking about 1994 and our transition because I thought it's something I can reflect on as someone who was there. I think those of us who are older on the call will have memories of it. But the point was that when those negotiations started happening for the transition, women very soon realized, number one, it was very visible by looking at the table that women simply were not there. And based on that recognition and the fear that once again we will be negotiated out of a women's position, there was this attempt. So, first of all, to recognize what happened was that remember all the women's organizations were collected in this United Democratic Front coalition. So, it was very broad based. But with the return of the ANC to the country, the UDF structures collapsed, and effectively, those women's organizations became the ANC Women's League at the time. what happened at the time was 1992 was the formation of the National Women's Coalition. And I think in the National Women's Coalition, there's so much lessons in there that we haven't fully unpacked yet. But I think for the benefit of brevity, I think what we can think about it is a broad-based coalition around women's rights without a unifying ideology. And I think there's a lesson in there for us, because if in this moment we are seeking only to build alliances with feminists who understand feminism in the way that we do, then we're going to build a movement comprised of people that we can squeeze into a room. Yeah. So my big lessons from the Women's National Coalition was, in that space were left feminists. They were absolutely conservative women who were actually against the principle of choice. What had to happen in that space was a negotiation, repeated negotiation, until we could crystallize what was the minimum negotiating space. And as a result of that work, highly imperfect space, lots of compromises, the equality clauses were secured in the Constitution. And the reason why I tell that long story is, I think today, 26 years down the line, with all our unhappiness with our country, we tend to forget that those equality clauses were not there. There wasn't great appetite from the men at the negotiating table to include it there. It was strategic positioning from women around that. So I think there's a lesson in there for us to learn and to configure, to reflect on strategy that women employed, the women who came before us. So for me, again, I think as Nikki says, and Pindi as well, that COVID has laid bare the gendered and racial nature of inequality and poverty in our country. I think it didn't lay bare to Black women. Working class Black women always knew that was their reality, that they're on the edges of society and marginality and are doing a lot to keep other poor people alive. But I think in the mainstream, so the issue again about narrative, I think that narrative has come forward, that other people are starting to recognize, government has recognized, donors are starting to see it. So while I'm mentioning donors, I do want to say that I'm not here representing my organization that I work for, but and there's a limit, I think, to what I can say about it, but I'm going to go there in any case. So what I want to say is about funding very particular. I think it's important to recognize that funding has a long history in the region. So it's important that we also don't think of funding in the South African context, even though there are specifics to the South African context. But if you take a longer term view of funding, development funding in the region, it's completely colonial. In fact, what happens in the region, the explosion of NGOs and development money to the continent coincides completely with the introduction of structural adjustment. So for those who know what structural adjustment is, at its heart, it's about the shrinking of the state. So you basically say, make the government as small as possible, don't do social grants, don't have an inflated, that's their language, civil service, and externalize all the functions of state to the market. The market will take care of things. We know what a disastrous recipe that was, and now we are now still paying the consequences of structural adjustment. But it is no coincidence that the proliferation of NGOs happened at exactly that moment. And that moment is also the sharp increase of development money to our continent. South Africa, because of our apartheid history and our own liberation struggle, is somewhat on a different timeline. Our money comes later and leaves sooner because of uh, uh, the transition to democracy. And I think everybody knows the story that in the anti-apartheid movement, there was lots of money that flowed to our country, especially from the Nordic countries, but generally in the North. There was great solidarity in many ways, but money in particular that came to our country. And at the point of transition, the feeling was that we have succeeded in a sense. I think the donors were very relieved because they could claim success in a way that they can't easily in any other context. But that was also the basis for the withdrawal. We see them starting to step back. And as someone who's engaged with many of these donors and tried to make the argument that you can't withdraw because in many ways South Africa is a microcosm of the world. If you look at the money that we have in the country, there's actually enough money. We're a middle income country. So in objective terms, there's enough money in this country for every one of us to live a decent life, not an extravagant life, not an elaborate life. So it points to the issue of distribution and how we share the wealth in of our country. So for me, what struck me in the COVID moment was, as has always been the case, it is working class Black women who are doing more to keep other poor people alive than any corporation, any middle class person. I really think if we found a way to count the subsidy of working class Black women to the COVID response, it would far outnumber the 3 billion of the Solidarity Fund. Not only in this moment, but I think repeatedly. We all know that this has always been the case, that there is more solidarity between the poor. It's not monetized, so no one counts it because it's invisible and it doesn't matter. But as a strategic feminist project, that might be an important one for us. So what the COVID moment also did is it made visible the thousands of grassroots women's movements. I don't know how much of these are feminist, actually doesn't matter to me. For me, it's made visible to those of us who see ourselves as actor at the national center. And it also reinforced to me the extent to which we have invisibilized movements who we don't know. We don't know their names, we don't know their structures. They're not structured as NGOs. They're not permanent, they're not consolidated. And I do think that there is the kind of the hope that I get from the COVID moment is the fact that there is actually a national footprint for a national movement of sorts, if we can figure out the strategy to pull that together in a way that doesn't pull people together around a centrally defined agenda. So for me as feminists, part of our challenge is to start building feminist struggles around the practical livelihood struggles of poor women in the country. So I think about something practical like the bread cartel. In our country, we know there's been a bread cartel in our country for a long time. We know the Competition Commission found them guilty. They were fined some millions. They paid it lach, very easy for them. That's pocket change. And the bread prices didn't come down after that. So despite the fact that this is a staple food in our country, and the bread price quite literally amounted to stealing food out of the mouths of children in our country. As feminists, we have never thought about something like the bread cartel as a legitimate focus for campaigning, because we have limited ourselves to the question of gender-based violence, unfortunately. So about gender-based violence and our playing in that neat quarter, I always, because I know this is a critique from men often, why are the feminists so obsessed with gender-based violence? And I always respond in the same way. I say, we are not crazy. The precondition to us being engaged in struggle is to be alive. And we are confirmed, it's uncontested that the rates of violence we experience as women in this country is akin to women in a war zone. So when we say that there's a war on our lives, we are not being dramatic. We are simply stating a statistical fact that this is the case. But I do think our historical limitations of our struggle and our struggle imagination to the question of violence has limited us and made us ill-prepared for this moment. And the one thing that I think we've been very weak at historically is the question of economics. So I think if we call ourselves feminists and we still haven't made the link between our struggles as women and the neoliberal system, the system of capitalism, then that's where we need to do some work. And I think that space is very intimidating. It's dominated by white men and men in general. And so I do think a big part of our feminist strategy should be, how do we demystify the notion of economics as it's the truth is economics is not even a science. If it was science, these economists would have been able to predict 2008. They would have had a vision about what COVID is going to mean in economic terms. Read the papers, none of them could predict any of it because economics is not a science. There's a few theories, and most of what we accept to be hard economic facts are in fact perceptions. So if you consider the value of our currency, if we consider how Moody's rate us, it's completely their perception of whether the country is stable or not. And so I do think part of what we need to concentrate on going forward is to get into what is called the hard issues, if we're going to position ourselves properly. So I do think part of our challenge is the absence of a women's movement. And I say this with all the respect to women's organizations in our country. But I think that the people who've led the conversations about women's rights in our countries have been NGOs. So I don't want to contribute to that lazy binary of big bad NGOs, poor movements, because I don't think that's very useful. I think what we need to do is figure out how do we have different organizational forms working in orchestra towards a shared objective, and how do we manage that power dynamic. And I know that that power dynamic repeatedly plays itself out in our landscape. I think it's exploded in the C19 coalition now once again. But again, I think if we are historical about it, this is the iteration of something that's always been present in the social justice landscape. Think about the National Land Committee and the Landless People's Movement. Think about UKZN and Abashlali, UKZN Center for Civil Society. Think about Women on Farms and Sikula Sonke. Think about what's happening in R2K right now. Think about what happened in the Social Justice Coalition. It's when we as activists from different class backgrounds, middle class, working class, come into one space and try to work together, that inevitably there's this explosion. And the reality is that it's not it's not inevitable. There are other places in the world, most notably in the Latin American context, where organizations seem to have found a better way of making that space work, because it's not about challenging who should lead. I think it's non-negotiable that our struggles must be built around the needs and priorities and aspiration of working class women. No? But I'm saying what we need to figure out is say that if we look at revolutions in history, the middle class have always played an instrumental role in serving the central struggle. What our problem is, as soon as we come into the same space, working class voices are silenced and recede, and it's effectively a middle class space. And so I do think part of what we need to do is figure out, have a very tough conversation about what is required for us to draw the best of both, and for NGOs to recognize their limitations. So that's the first step, I think, is for NGOs to recognize that nowhere in the history of the universe have NGOs been able to lead the radical change. There's no dramatic social change anywhere in the history where NGO has been in the front. We know from our experience in the liberation movement, NGOs played a role in that, but NGOs were on the margins with the supporting structures. But if you look in the C19 coalition, which is the most recent experience, you can see which voices are dominant and which are not. So I must also declare my limitations in the C19 space, that I wasn't actively in the center. I've been in some of the spaces, but the one thing that really struck me was the pace of mobilization and how that urgency to call a shutdown on the 1st of August, 4 days before the 1st of August, just completely privileges those who speak English, those who have data, and so on. So I think one of the things we have to make peace with is the crisis is not going to be over tomorrow, that there are immediate and urgent needs, and that should be a priority. But if we're going to shift power in this time, we mustn't be deluded that we can do it in 1 week, that we actually have to slow down, because the faster we go as movements of collectives, the more people we leave behind. I've got 3 other points that I'm going to make very quickly. Fikile, sorry, you didn't say how long I should talk. So if I'm too long, just shout.
No, that's all right. Yeah, no, that's okay. It's fine, Fatima. You can keep going. Thanks.
Yeah. The other thing that has struck me is that we don't control the landscape of struggle. So that means that we often, if we're in those coalitions, we're going to sit in rooms with people who are not feminists. Yeah? We're going to sit in rooms with people who are sometimes hostile to us. And we must decide whether that is our primary focus for angry energies, because we've got a lot of reason to be angry, or whether we want to fundamentally say, actually, that's a potential comrade to convert. And what does it mean when we encounter them saying offensive things? Do we say that at this stage we expect people to understand our feminism, to understand what patriarchy means, or do we say as a strategy? When I encounter a working class man from Orange Farm who says something obnoxious and sexist in a C19 space, what is my space going, what is my position going to be? Because to me, he is not my primary enemy. I think we have to be clear that the systemic targets for our struggle and that the individuals who are in those systems shouldn't get the brunt of our wrath. And I'm not saying that we should allow people to be sexist or say offensive things. I just think that there is almost a fear by people who are not feminists to be in a room with us because they're so afraid of saying something wrong. And the reason why I think it's important for us to recognize that is because I know that if I go back in my own history, I'm offended by myself. My feminism has evolved, and it's evolved because other people were very generous to me when I made very fundamental mistakes about what feminism was, then without even knowing it. I only realized later. So now when I go back and I read the things I wrote, if I see myself in a public platform, some of those I want to delete from the internet because I'm so embarrassed with it. But when we encounter people who have not even heard the word feminism yet, we don't show a generosity of spirit. So I think we must recognize that we are still on the margins as feminists. The word patriarchy has gone mainstream in our country, which is an achievement. I don't know if they mean the same thing by patriarchy when they say it, but it is an achievement because a decade ago, no one recognized patriarchy as a construct. Now you switch on the TV, it's State of the Nation address, and the president is nailing patriarchy. And I don't think we must take that for granted. Those things came through struggle. But as I'm saying, is we are going to be confronted and made uncomfortable with the spaces that we're going to have to go in, and we're going to have to need active strategies and how we mediate that there's opportunities to win people over without selling out on our own principles. And I recognize that's a fine line. I did speak about the importance of gender-based violence work, but not limiting ourselves there. And I think there's an urgency to build a cadre of feminist economists in our country. There are very few. I get phone calls on a regular basis by people who want to convene conversations about economy, and they're asking me, where's the feminist economists? And there are 2 or 3 recognized feminist economists in the country. So that's a project I think we need to take on. I think maybe 2 last points. Sorry. The one is that I think when I look back at, to talk about gender-based violence, one of the, I think our blind spots has been, we've invested all our energies in focusing on the criminal justice system. So there's no doubt in my mind that the criminal justice system is fucked. It's not working for us. It needs to be fixed. But I also recognize increasingly that that cannot be the sum total of our dreams for ourselves for a violence-free life. That the criminal justice system is what kicks in after things have gone wrong. And that the much harder work is the work of value change. Because at the heart of this crisis, not the COVID crisis. I call the COVID crisis the second crisis. Our first crisis is the crisis of patriarchy in our country and in our lives. Is the fact that there are not enough prisons in this country for all the men who perpetrate the crimes. And these men are not monsters. They are products of our society. We are all in some way contributing to producing them. And unless we disrupt that nexus of value reproduction, then it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how many more prisons we build. And we also know that those prisons are themselves sites of reproduction of toxic masculinity. So one last point, and then I'm going to conclude with raising a few questions that I think we should talk about. My last point is quite controversial. I want to talk about political parties and the feminist movement. And I do think what has happened over time, and it's not limited to feminist spaces, it's the social justice sector in broad. I think many people who are in the social justice space are members or aligned to political parties. But because in our space, it's become such a no-no. People hide their links to those parties. I think it's only now with the EFF that there's been an emergence and a reclaiming of political party space. I think we need an open conversation about what the possibilities of strategic alliances with not political parties themselves, but key people in there. Because I think we must also recognize that those of us who've spent some of our lives in the apartheid era celebrate the fact that today there are political parties that we can be active members of. And I think that the limitation of not claiming that space is also relinquishing the fact that we fought for that space. We fought for the possibility that Black women can be active in political parties, and now we've dismissed them as part of the system and untouchable. So, for example, all our attentions are focused on union buildings, but the reality is we've all known for a long time the real decisions are made in Lutuli House. So, regardless of what you think about the ANC, if you're going to change power in this country, if you do want to change power policies, the most effective thing you could possibly do is have a meeting with the NEC. And it doesn't mean that you endorse the ANC, it just means that strategically you recognize where you need to go to get things done. So I want to refer us to the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanctions the Palestinian rights movement. I'm not going to talk about the sexual harassment and that crisis, that's a disaster. What I want to talk about is how effective they've been in getting the government to adopt their policies. So they don't do the things that traditional NGOs do. They basically went straight for that international relations task team, convinced them, got it through a policy conference and so on. And we saw the same recently with the decriminalization of sex work and that policy recommendation that came through the ANC policy conference. And I do think as the women's rights movement, as feminists, we need to be realistic about the lay of the land, where power is located, and where we can start tapping into power for our own interests without selling out. But I think it needs a conversation. And then the last thing is, I think what we need to start doing, if we are serious about the feminist movement, is we need to start crafting a feminist vision. So we've never had a national conversation about what a feminist movement would look like, what are the principles, what holds it together. But I do think we should probably choose that as a priority goal to work towards in a post lockdown period, so that we can very quickly consolidate on the significant achievements that women and women's organizations have secured in the period, and then start building towards our vision. So some of the key questions I think we should consider in having that conversation is, how do we build our feminist agenda around the practical livelihood needs of women, and not some abstract intellectual wondering about what feminism is. I think we must say, what does a typical woman in our country look like? Where does she live? What matters to her? And then build our feminist struggles around that. I think we must. I think back to the 80s, where they were in those movements where systems of secondment. So if the NGOs want to play a role, there is a secondment possibility where you say someone with skills who can write, who knows how to organize, gets assigned to Orange Farm or gets assigned to Manenberg, and your role is to accompany those grassroots women's organizations who don't yet call themselves feminists. But if they get exposure, and if someone does a bit of nurturing with them, then it's possible that can go from a soup kitchen who just feeds women on a regular basis to making the connection between why there isn't food in communities and a feminist vision for communities and themselves. I think we need to talk about the gender machinery, because we need to understand that there's there's a limit to what we can achieve as civil society if there's not an equivalent structure in state to take up the recommendations that we want. So I think we must step back and ask, is this national strategy plan, the Gender-Based Violence Council, now our gender machinery in state, or is there something else we need that's bigger than that? I think we need to two last questions. So the one is, we need to think about structure of such a feminist movement. So again, if you think about how our historical mass-based movements have evolved, think about that old structure of branches. I think political parties have something like the ANC or the Youth League branches, and then regional structures and provinces, and then you get to national. And then we saw now with the Fees Must Fall movement, it went completely to the other end of the spectrum, where it's completely decentralized without a permanent recognized leadership. So I think this is the model that we followed for total shutdown for the actual March 2 years ago. And that there are advantages to that, but there's definite disadvantages, because when we try to reorganize a follow-on event, then we basically had to start from ground zero to start building those communication structures and so I think a greater feminist movement probably lives somewhere in between those two extremes and makes the best use of that, but we don't have the capacity to keep rebuilding from ground zero when the next crisis comes along. And then the last one is really one that I've touched on already. It's saying, what kind of strategic alliances do we need to form with those who don't necessarily self-identify as feminists? So I think we need to take a realistic look at the landscape, recognize the fact that we are not in control, and that if we want things to shift, we are going to have to make alliances with people who don't call themselves feminists. I'm thinking of the trade union movements in particular, which in our country is probably the biggest organized formation of working class women in the country. Think about now and all the nurses, all the public servants who are in there. They don't have a feminist agenda because they don't have any feminist imagination in the trade union. But we as feminists have never tried to actively. I think over time there's been sporadic engagement with the trade unions, but there's not been a systematic project that says, as feminists, we're going to take this on, and this is how we want to shape the workers' movement in our country. I think the last thing I want to say, Fikile, is just to say that Nikki and I are both from known donor organizations in our country, and there is something called the Social Justice Donor Formation. And it's very interesting that the majority of women in that room now are Black women. So when we were all in the room, I was quite shocked as a newcomer to that space. But those of us who are there are not in control of the decision making in that space. So we are also fighting our own feminist battles in that space. So I'm also asking for some understanding of the fact that we are fighting for our own agency, that there's power dynamics there, but it might be useful in a feminist conversation to identify who are the allies in that, in the same way that I spoke about strategic alliances across the spectrum, is to identify who are those feminists in those spaces that we can nurture strategic alliances with, because it's very difficult for us also to speak on open platforms about the struggles we are engaging in those spaces, because those are places of work and there's limitations to what we can talk about. But I think it goes without saying that those spaces are also not uncontested, that it's not clear feminist spaces regardless of whatever slogans the donors give in relation to women's rights, and that we should think about who's there. And the conversation that Dickie and I often have is about how do we as Black women who are there now not legitimate those spaces with our bodies and our colors without being there and fundamentally shifting a donor rights agenda. So just to say that those battles are on there, but I think none of us are blind to the contradictions that exist in that world. So I think I'm going to end on that note and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fatima. You've given us so much. Thank you for your generosity. I'm not even going to speak much because we need to open up the floor. I saw a couple of hands earlier on. Unati, your hand was the first one to stand up. Please come through. Vanessa, you'll be next.
Thank you, Comrade Fikile. Thokozo Gogo. I'd like to thank the speakers, uSisiphinda ndithi kuqala, uNikki and uFatima. There are a couple of interesting points that they've raised, but I've also have some kind of follow-up questions to that, specifically to them as well. Usiphindi spoke about mental health. And I'm thinking, honestly, we are a country that is in crisis when it comes to our mental health, but also our spiritual health. I think we are a country that came from war, but no one spoke about it. Because to me, colonization and apartheid is exactly what war looks like. And we came out of that, also having to deal with diseases of the time, your likes of cancer, your like of TB. And so it seems like that's what we always go through in this country is if there's a crisis or a pandemic, then it will always be followed by some kind of disease. And I'm not too sure if that's something that we are looking at. Does it happen because that's how nature works, or is it something done by capitalists so that they keep us busy with our health issues as opposed to focusing on the system itself? So I want us to look into that, because after apartheid, then in came the so-called democracy. The first thing that we had to deal with when we were dealing with getting excited with democracy, it was HIV. And from HIV, then we moved to 2008, and now we're here with COVID-19. And we have not healed as a country from all these moments. We are expected to immediately jump from one pandemic to being okay, and we are expected to organize, to mobilize, and NGOs are always bringing in, the donors have a way of bringing money around this crisis in these moments, and as if then there's going to be a change, then there's going to be something. And I'm also trying to figure what is the agenda of the donors themselves. Is the agenda pure? Is what is this word development? Because I have a problem with this word, because when I say I'm developing you, does it mean that I think I'm already developed and therefore I'm helping you? Am I empowering you because I feel powered enough to empower you? So the NGOs themselves, they're not coming into the space as part of society. It's always us versus them. Similarly to the politicians, it brings me to the point that Fatima had made, that we tend to think that as civil society or as NGOs, we will be better than those women that are in politics. But yet we forget that what we think they're doing is what we are also doing to those people that we think we are serving. Because we are not making ourselves as part of that community. We think that we have this power that we have to help someone else, as opposed to being part of a society and organizing our society to be better. So for me, that is one of my problems with the NGO sector, is this kind of language that is being used, this development language, empowerment language. And the second aspect to it is, when we speak of mental health awareness, Pindi, what is it exactly that we might be looking at? And how do we get the donors to actually start funding programs that have something to do with healing? Because that is not available at the moment. And yet we know from a feminist perspective that that's what we need to do, is to heal each other. And this is why probably we're at loggerheads with each other when we meet someone who has no understanding of feminism. We constantly have to prove ourselves, or the donors themselves have not helped in terms of funding projects that have something to do with healing. So I'd like to challenge our sisters that are part of the donor space. What is it that you think that donors are not able to, fund healing, especially in an African manner? How we organize ourselves as Africans around the fire. We organize ourselves in that space. Why is it that then we find it difficult to fund healing, to fund art? It's very rare where you find an NGO that is basically about art. And we know that women are they are very artistic. We expect express ourselves in that manner. So for me, those are the issues that I have. The third point that I wanted to come to was when it comes to civil movement in us as people that are calling ourselves feminist, and when we come into the space, I think Fatima made a reference to Right to Know. It's really sad what is going on there. Also for us as women, when we relate to each other, when we see ourselves in this space, because then we do find ourselves in a space where we feel that we need to sit on that table that men are sitting. And to get there, you know, the system mostly of all these civil movements is the voting system. Can we challenge this voting system? Because I've seen people being dehumanizing each other when it comes to the voting aspect of things. So how then do we think that moving forward from a feminist perspective that we need systems like those? Is it not that then voting system also really puts us in a very vulnerable space, because suddenly you now have to canvass for your vote, and when you canvass, you're going to speak about people, you're going to start character assassinate people. It's been happening. It's happening all over. It's currently happening now right now, because that is the moment that they're being faced with. So, and then I must isolate that person because then I don't agree with their ideology, you know what I mean? So it is these kinds of, conversations that I think we need to have. Yeah, I will leave it out there for now.
Enkosi kakhulu, Gogo Thokozani. Vanessa?
On guns, fix. Yes, interesting. Lots to think about. Thank you very much for the presentations. Radical feminist organizing and resources is always going to be a problem, isn't it? Because where do we get our funding from? We get our funding from people that do not want us to be radical in our organizing and in our visions for the future. And so for me, it's about how do we raise the resources? So we have seen what is commonly seen as mutual aid in America. I was having a wonderful conversation with women from America yesterday, from working class communities, who are talking about mutual aid and how working class women have been able to, given the current situation there, where Black people, in particular Black communities and Latino communities in particular, are facing heavy opposition, as well as Native American communities, which we don't speak about because they're on the reservations, and how they have managed to organize and to resist in this time leading up to the American elections of COVID-19, and what they're able to do. And that is through the concept of mutual aid. We are there for one another. Fatima does raise this question, and for me, it's amazing what's happening in our communities, in the various working class communities, what women are busy doing. I mean, I find that the most inspirational thing. We don't always speak about it. We speak about the food parcels, but we're actually just doing other stuff as well that I think are going to be outlasting and going to build up actually different kinds of community economies, which for me is the key to how we're going to change things in the future. But this is about radical feminist organizing movements and movement building, with a footnote that it seems that each, when we don't agree with one another, we go off and build our own movements. Né? So we probably got to meet. So I don't know if Fatima comes on this one movement. She is very ambitious, and I love the ambition. So I mean, so for me, it's about, the first thing is around funding. Second thing is around our vision, and we don't have to all agree, right? Because we're not going to agree. There are too many different feminisms, and we're not all going to agree. But if we talk about radical feminist organizing or radical feminist visions, it's going to have to be anti-capitalist. And I don't think that even the feminist organizations or movements that we see today are actually taking that very strong anti-capitalist stance, and actually putting it out there in the economic discussion. Because I have been to a number of discussions on feminist economies, and yet there's nothing new about what they're bringing. There's no new normal. We keep speaking about the new normal. We can even go back to the same ways of running the economy, the environment, etc. But nothing practical is coming out of it. And yet in the communities in which I am located every now and then, there are answers coming out. And I find that fascinating. And they're not, as Fatima says, they're not necessarily feminists. But I also want to make the other point, and this is the point I've been making for years. Listen, when we were in the anti-apartheid struggle, or the decolonization struggle, or the, well, because we saw colonialism not necessarily being over under apartheid, it was just the extension of colonialism. We wanted state power. We had no, even if we called ourselves feminists, and we were slowly learning about feminism at the time, we wanted state power. We might want to shift and change how the state looks now. At that time, we obviously had a particular vision or idea of how it is, but we didn't say we didn't want power. And what has happened is nowadays we don't want to speak about that power. That we want to take over the country, man. We want to run the country because we want to run the country differently. And if you say we want to run the country, it's almost as if to say, yo, why are you now, in a lot of feminist spaces, you are now being power hungry. No, I'm not. I want to change things. Just like the ANC and other movements like the PAC and the BC movement said, we want to take over so that we can build better lives for our people. So feminists want to take over the country and so we can build better lives for our people. What that will look like is going to be a matter of contestation during struggle. And we must accept that. But I think the first thing that we have to first put out there before we even begin to speak about how do we resource this is to say we want power and not to be afraid to say we want power. And so that's it. So whether they are women are in political parties and call themselves feminists, I don't necessarily agree with how they go about things strategically and otherwise, but they are at least have the guts to say they want power. They want power. They're going to contest with the men around power. We are saying it's movements, these movements that are going to change things somehow organically. No, they're not. I'm sorry to say, but they are not. And at sometimes you have to seize power in order to make change. So I just want to say thanks very much. And I would like us to, when we speak about resources, we cannot have resources unless we have some measure of power in the first place. Yes, mutual aid can only help us so far. We can see that now in the communities in which we work. Providing food, maybe running food gardens, doing little other things. I mean, we've got a little loan scheme going in Fully Anywhere loan kind of scheme, where we all raise money, 500 Rand, a woman starts a little thing. Then as she contributes, we raise 500 Rand for the next person. They start the little sewing thing. And even if it's just making masks, whatever it is, but some sort of thing, but that's micro level, that's survivalist level, that is not seriously changing the world and changing the economy. So yeah, I mean, maybe in this case, the people who do have, even though their power might be limited in these spaces, in these donor spaces, they do have a bit more power than the rest of us. So maybe they should think about how can they find that space, those spaces where we can have those kinds of conversations around real economic power, where we're actually influencing how capitalism slowly is going to be slowly transformed into something else. Because real revolutions take long. They're not coup d'etats, that's 90 degrees. Revolutions are 360 degrees. They don't happen overnight. And it's a long process. And as we are making the new world, as we are envisioning and trying to make the new world, we are also unfortunately remaking the same world because we live in this world. So it's at that point of contradiction, where we ourselves are also reinforcing the world that we are living in, but at the same time, desperately trying to remake this world, to make a different world. And we've got to pat ourselves sometimes on the back for that, because the very fact that we believe we can change this world, I mean, with the limited power that we have, means that we do believe in ourselves. We do actually believe that we are able to change this world. So I'm just appealing, maybe if Nikki and Fatima can speak about how they see their roles in the spaces they occupy. How to take some of that reparations money, because it's not for me donors. You are giving us like 0.1% of the reparations due to us. How that some of that reparations money can be used so that we rethink our forms of organization, and we rethink our kinds of economies that we need to have, and that we start looking at power and what kind of power we must build in order to get enough power to reshape our world. But yeah, thanks so much, Fix. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for those words. I just want to bring in the chat room before we come back to you, Fatima and Nikki, and Pindi. Pindi is still with us on the line on WhatsApp. So just want to go to the chat room. There's a lot of challenges around load shedding. Candice has had to apologize because of that. We are noting that load shedding just started and I don't have enough battery to last me, so I'll watch over the recording. Thank you so much, Candice, for joining us. We appreciate the effort. Pindi keeps falling in and out also because of load shedding. So we do have that problem. Vanessa says, agreed, a lot of us are experiencing load shedding at different times, and interconnectivity is a problem. And it's a national question as well, the question of electricity and power. We'll get to it another day. Palisa says, apologies, I will also catch up in 15 minutes. So there are these things, realities that are not enabling all of us to be in this conversation. And Jackie the poet says, I'm grateful to be here. Womandla, I really appreciate the space. Zogiswa Ngobo also says, I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting us. Jackie the poet says, yes, we want a feminist revolution and a government, unapologetically so. Yes, Comrade Vanessa, power is not given, it is taken. So those are some of the reflections that are coming from the space of the chat room. So here is the thing. I think there's a lot that has been said. Fatima, I don't know. One of the speakers mentioned the fact that I think one of the biggest challenges is the fact that it's not solidarity, because we have love for each other. So when we talk about power, and you did mention the fact that solidarity does exist amongst various struggles and what we don't see as movements, but bodies and formations of the poor, of the working class, of feminist formations. But the challenge is the recognition of that. The fact that it is seen as not being structured and therefore not fundable, right, in the manner that organizing is happening. So that is the majority. And that is a form of power, that is a form of organizing that you're challenging us to also say, and perhaps challenging also the donor environment and the capitalist arrangements of our countries and our world, to say, it is not that we do not have power, but it is because this power is constantly being invisibilized by capital, right? Because capital structures itself in certain ways. And if you don't then fit into that structure of the capital, you don't exist. But it doesn't mean that you don't exist. So I just wanted to bring that up. And somebody also said there is definitely war in our lives, and that war is economic. And we don't have enough time, so it's about 3:37. I do want to bring maybe Nikki in, because you did say that you definitely have to leave at 4. Before, and then it will be you, Fatima, just to reflect on the questions that have come in the room. In the meantime, I'll also see if there's any reflections on YouTube that I can feed up later. Thanks. Over to you, Nikki.
Thanks, Fikile. I mean, I think Unati raises some really important points. And just to highlight again what Fatima says, I think that when we talk about a movement, Vanessa, I hear you. I hear the sense of like, will this happen? But I think it's about time that we start to look at what we can do. I think for a long time, even within the women's rights movement, leave the feminists out of it. We've really just struggled ideologically, and so we just didn't come together because it was just too much. And quite frankly, we are all traumatized, as some of the speakers have raised in this country, and so it's just too much to take on. But I do think that within a donor environment, there are those of us who are seeking to find ways to do things differently. How we do that is difficult. As Fatima says, we fight our own battles internally. We are not the end yes-sayers. We are sort of somewhere in between. But we do try and move that. And so just talking about that and talking about what are some of the ways in which we can try and make differences. I think one of the things we realize is that there has been during this pandemic amazing solidarity at the coalface, right? The women who are feeding each other, who are helping, who are sharing. For example, I was part of a conversation the other day where women in one area in KwaZulu-Natal had received food parcels, but they had to show their identity documents. So what they were doing was they were sharing identity documents with migrant women and women who were unregistered. So there are ways in which we were coming together. And so I think that organizations also need to be quite vocal about what they want funding to be. I don't think it's necessarily fair to always say that funders invisibilize. I think, yes, they do, and they can be, but I think there are points at which organizations also need to raise their power and to direct. So to say, you know, we want to organize in this way. How can we find each other? What is the ways in which we can start to fund in ways that people are asking for? And one of the key things that donors love to say, they love to say we fund, we are able, we make available spaces for people to engage. That in and of itself is quite powerful. So that if you use their language about let's find spaces where people can engage, you then can come together and engage on things that are quite radical. And so I feel like that's the way in which we can do. I do think that there is a move, certainly within the donor organization I come from, to recognize and understand, to fund deficits in organizations, to fund reserves, to fund healing. Because if we don't do that, all we do is we end up projectizing, and already we do. We sort of monetize development in ways that are so unhealthy because it does come from a language that we understand, which is capitalist anyway. And donors are a construct of capitalism. So if we're going to overthrow that, we're going to overthrow the ways in which donors need to fund. The last thing I want to reflect on is that I think that within the spaces, what we can do, and this is to Vanessa's question, and I think Fatima, I speak on behalf of Fatima, but I certainly think that the conversations we have is, how do we make sure that donors recognize, they always talk about recognizing their power, but they don't do it in meaningful ways. How do we as Black women in those spaces start to help our donor partners understand what their power actually is and how dangerous and debilitating it can be? And we've seen that throughout. They've debilitized, I guess if that's a word, many sectors, many organizations because of the way in which they fund. So how do we as Black women in those organizations raise those issues and make those the call for lasting sustainable funding has been one that we've been talking about for a long time. We continue to talk about that. But again, who are we funding? We're funding NGOs. We're not funding movements sufficiently. And so again, we need a space, and I love your idea, Fatima, about a space where as women we can come together, whether we are feminist or not, to talk about how we address the issues together. And again, it can be strategic alliances, it could be tactical alliances. You know, I don't necessarily want to be in a space where somebody's working on beneficiation for mining. I believe mining is bad for people and for the environment. But if we come together in that space, it's tactical, right? There's power in numbers. And so I like that idea. And I think that donors need to be made much more aware of the power of people, right? And not constantly talking about how we are giving, you know, we helping or I love the thing is we're building movements, right? Donors say we're building movements. It's such a misnomer. We need to be funding the people who are building movement. That's what we need to be doing, and we need to understand our role in that. And we need to be challenged. We need to be challenged. We need to be prepared, as Tendai says. We need to be prepared to be remade. Because if we're not prepared to be remade, then our struggle from the beginning is over. The last thing I just want to say is there's really, for me, the strength around a collective approach and building solidarity across struggles, right? So we've already seen the women's rights movement be very disparaging of the LGBTQI movement, right? So we want that collective. We want people to come together around that. But also, as South Africans, we need to step out of and across the border, and we need to start building solidarity on the continent. The power is on the continent. The power is Pan-African. It's not South African. We're not special. We're not wonderful because of apartheid. We actually need to reach out and we need to learn. And we need to share and we need to build solidarity. So if women in Mozambique are being asked for sexual favors for food parcels after Cyclone Idai, South African women need to be standing in solidarity with those women. And likewise building that. So for me, those are really the important things. Building solidarity, being intersectional about how we work, as Fatima has said, come together with the allies that you ordinarily normally wouldn't. Use donor language against them. Don't tell my organization I said that, but use the language in a way that they understand. Find, as Fatima says, those people in the organizations who are allies, who are fighting their own internal battles to make funding much more real. And as Vanessa says, it is reparations, right? So we are just giving back what was taken. And constantly work on power, constantly work on undoing power, power of men, power of women, power of the feminists over the non-feminists, power of religion over lives, power of state over us, constantly talking about power in those donor spaces.
Nikki, that is so beautiful. Thank you so much. I just want to throw a challenge as well. Also, that just to say, I think I love the way you put it. We need to be allowed to be renamed as donors. We need to not see ourselves as people that build movements, but we need to fund movements, people themselves that are building the movements. And one of the things that I would propose to us as a challenge that is urgent in COVID-19 is to say that let us love power. Vanessa was saying we should not be afraid of power. Power is part of our lives. Let us use power to bridge. And one of the proposals and that I would say let us begin to even imagine urgently is to say, how do we then let us fund the unstructured in a structured way? I don't know if that makes any sense. So we need to take capital to where it belongs. Capital belongs to the people that are building movements, and those people do not have bank accounts. Those people do not have even organizations. Those people don't live in organizations because organizations are structured in ways that throw radical voices away. So radical voices that are actually the voices and the bodies, and it's all of us. It's not just one person or this person. It's a struggle that is within. So it is not in structures. The structures that we constantly look for are not built to be able to create movements, but what is actually building movements is on the pavements. So we're not going to find documentation there. We're not going to find systems in place, but systems are sitting within structured organizations like donor organizations. So the challenge is, let us reimagine, and the urgent reimagination is to say movements are built by people who are constantly living on the pavements. Let us take that money, that resource to the pavements where it belongs. That for me, and I don't, like I said, my role is to facilitate. So over to you, Fatima.
Thank you for the very challenging questions and comments in the chat. I want to say that I think there must be a confrontation with donors, not as individual organizations, but as a collective. So Vanessa, that what you call my plan for one movement is not a plan, it's a fantasy. What I think we need to build some kind of national structure that links movements between each other, because Fikile, the power that movements have is dissipated because it's so decentralized. So we've got to find some linkages, ways of building that. So I think the bigger question, the framing kind of consideration is, if donors are part of the institutions, no, of power, which it is, then we can't expect them to fund their own dismantling. So what I'm saying is also recognize the limitations of historical donor money in funding a revolution, as it were, because that's our fantasy. So I think the conversation is, how do we engage with the donor collective as a collective? So don't go as one organization. You're just going to lose your funding if you have that confrontation. That's the reality of the power dynamic. So how do we go as a collective and say, this is what we think needs to happen? If you're serious about women's rights, this is where you need to be investing. But also recognize that donors are not going to have an epiphany and get to that awakening itself. It's going to be a contestation and a struggle there. So it's another center of power that the women's movement would have to challenge in the short term to get some of the resources to unlock the beginnings of that movement. But I'm saying, don't put all our eggs in that basket. The sum total of our revolution is not going to be funded there. So we're going to have to think creatively about what are other ways of doing it. And I know that we understand the reality of waging struggles, that it does take resources. But I also think that if we hang ourselves up too much on the log frame and the budget, then we forget the possibility of organic struggle without a budget, which there is evidence of throughout history, in our country, throughout the world, on the African continent, and so on. So I think we need to not make our struggles contingent on having donor contracts. And then I think the last thing to say is that donors cannot realistically fund the sum total of struggles. No? So if you think about Tokoza, I agree with you, the issue of mental health and our art, our creative being, there's very limited funding in that because donors have to compare the funding applications they get in the context of COVID. You're not going to fund art and healing when you know that people are dying of hunger. Yeah? And it's not limited to the COVID moment. We know that in generally that other side of our needs, our spirit, our artistic, creative side, doesn't receive development money at all. So the issue, and I think this is where the strategic thinking has to happen, is whose responsibility is that to resource that support in the longer term? Is it a state function? Do we say that out of the public purse, that kind of long-term funding should be, activities should be sustained? And what is the short term? What do you use donor money for in the short term to get you there? Because there's no donor in the country with enough money to fund the sum total of healing work that we need to invest significantly in nurturing artistic expression in our country, even though I recognize how important it is. But I'm also saying that we are dealing in a context where there's almost an agreed hierarchy of needs. Whether we agree with it or not doesn't matter. That is what is prevailing, you know. So even in the COVID context, you see all the command council focusing on food, because they consider that to be a priority. Gender-based violence we have to fight for as a secondary kind of allocation, even though there was a lot of political rhetoric about it. So for me, I think one of the key questions is whether we are ready for a feminist movement. Is there critical mass of feminist organizations in the country? And I imagine that at the state is probably not there. My own inclination is that we go wider, that we build a women's rights movement of some sort, and that we use that space to build feminism. Because if we start off by closing our room only to feminists, and I think that there's wisdom in maintaining a feminist room, a vanguard somewhere, you know, where we fortify our feminism, where we develop our feminist strategies to take into a broader world. But if we're going to build a broad-based alliance on a minimum platform of women's needs, then it's possible that at this point in our history, feminism is going to, the word feminism will close that possibility for us. I know that's controversial, but I'm saying it as a consideration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for throwing that controversy.
Yeah. Yeah.
We need it because it's, you know, it's part of the imagination, it's part of the building, it's part of strategy to say, you know, what are the most strategic and systemic things to do. And I think what you are suggesting to us is that perhaps it seems at this point we're at a place where we need to build together, as what we call women or feminists or anything, without particular ideology. So we need a coming together that is not formed against a particular ideology, because feminism is an ideological thought. And there's something to think about, because you're saying there's power in that, because it's a kind of building that is not alienating on the grounds of ideology, because ideology is not singular. It's, there's many of different types of feminisms, even within feminism itself. Thank you for those words, Fatima. I think it's a challenge that we would need to take. So it is 3:54. We have Pindi on the line. Pindi, before I bring you in, I know Nikki needs to leave at 4. Nikki, I don't know in the room if there's any 1 or 2 questions or anything that you would like to say to Nikki before she exits the space. I would request that we do that before we bring Pindi's closing remarks as well. Or maybe even from your side, Nikki, if you have anything that you'd like to say before you say goodbye to this session.
Yeah, if there aren't any questions for me, just to say thank you so much for letting me be part of this conversation, and I'm taking Fatima up on her movement. I'm there and I'm ready. I think it's time. I think it's time we start to come together. So thank you so much. And if there are further conversations, I would love to be part of it.
You're definitely going to be in the conversation. This is just the first of its kind, and yeah, we're definitely going to stay in conversation. Thank you so much, Nikki, and we'll see you in the nearest future. Thank you for your generosity of time that you've shared with us today, and your words. Okay, so Nikki exits on that note. We're going to bring Pindi. Pindi, I don't know if you have any reflections that you'd like to share.
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I've been in and out, logging in and out, so I didn't quite get everything and some of the questions, but I think I got a few of the starting questions of Unati about mental health and reflecting around how some of these diseases that have happened, that like your cancer, TB, that came after particular pandemics and so on. And I think she was asking about the issue of mental health and spiritual health. So for me, I think in trying to talk to that, I feel that it's important that when we're talking, for example, about mental health, in the work that we do, there's a lot of trauma that we deal with, right? That we don't necessarily get to talk about or to find ways of healing, and therefore I think when we are looking at ways of funding different things, it's important to talk about when you're talking about, for example, GBV, that causes a lot of trauma that as women we have to carry. And most of the time there isn't, space to find healing. So I think those are some of the things that need to be looked at. I think she spoke about art as a form of healing that is not used so much. And I think there's different ways. So when we are talking about healing, it could be, I just heard now about coming together. It's important even coming together, for example, using our hands, as whether we're doing gardening right now with this COVID situation. Food is very expensive. Food is going to be expensive even beyond the COVID-19. So it's important that people learn how to use their hands in making their own food. So those could be some of the things that donors could be looking at supporting. How do we support women or communities to be able to grow sustainable livelihoods without having to be dependent on grants and government. You know, using our bodies as in whether it's yoga, finding healing in that. I'm into health and wellness. I believe exercise is another form of finding healing. So, you know, we can look at things like how do we come together and just whether we walk together, we hike together, and release, you know, all the tensions that we carry that affect us emotionally and psychologically. So I think all those things are very important that we take forward in the work that we want to do. If we want to see any change in, you know, how we work.
So much. So much for that. We truly appreciate that that we need to also see some resources that we've got, because we've got that power, and that power is ourselves and our bodies and our relationships and our bonds, and that we maximize those as much as possible, because that's also a form of dealing with health. So siyabonga kakhulu from what you are sitting. I don't see any hands in the room, so I'm going to, you know, sort of ask for last reflections also from the chat room if there are any thoughts. I see a couple of people have fallen off in it. I know it's load shedding and a couple of other things, so feel free to do the last reflections and then we'll round up. Jackie the poet, please come through.
Yes, I have to say, I've learned a lot from this space today. These conversations are absolutely necessary. But beyond that, as Nikki said before she left, to come up with practical ways of implementing it. And Fatima, you are such an educator. You are such a wealth of knowledge, and you're so kind, and you know all these things that that we inspire to be. To say that it's a, I think Vanessa also said it in the chat room. You know, it's not a fantasy, as she said, it's a vision. You know, you're not fantasizing, and as a poet and as a spiritual person, to also say that it's an idea whose time has come. In fact, it's in the cosmos, and I think we can all feel it in our spaces, and it's going to happen with or without us, with or without the funders. It's just an idea whose time has come. And I think when we talk to political power and do people want power or not, women in particular have never had power. I mean, let's look at US, for example. There hasn't even been a woman president there, you know. I think one of the reasons is that we are unable to close rank, whereby mostly men or males and people, let's say white people, are able to do that whether they like each other or not. And to be able to now have this kind of conversation where we have so much behind us that we've learned about in the past, I think it's a perfect, beautiful time to connect and to close rank in that way. And I'm also hearing as well that, you know, this is at the same time, it seems critical because this is how this world operates. At the same time, we don't want to be part of it. And that's when then we need the creativity of finding a place called and, not either or. And people are very intelligent here. So I think when we engage, we can be able to do that, as well as make sure that we don't throw out the baby out with the bathwater, and we're also realistic in that process. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate the space.
Thank you so much, Jackie the poet, for your beautiful words. Thank you, and those reflections are well received. Okay, so I don't see any other hands, so I'm sort of going to bring the conversation into a round up by saying thanks to everyone that has come up here. What I'm hearing us saying is that Fatima is challenging us to say there are short-term targets. We need to be systemic in the way that we are doing this, right? There are short-term targets, there are immediate targets, and there are long-term targets. So we need to measure, you know, in the immediate, during this pandemic, what are the things that we need to do as we strive towards that vision, which is the feminist government definitely a feminist-led government. There are things that we need to do, and I hear Pindi saying some of those things that we need to do in the immediate. We need to definitely love one another. We need to take care of one another. Those bonds that we share, plant gardens in our homes. Let us go back and build our relationships with earth and with each other. And Fatima is also emphasizing that, to say the way that we're going to do it is not so much centering the ideology, as much as we hold these ideologies, not so much centering the differences that we share. You know, one of those being ideology. Some of them could be race, some of them could be class. You spoke a lot about that, Fatima. Some of them could be age, some of them could be privilege and locality and all of that. That these are the differences that we carry, but in the immediate, we need to lay our weapons down. We need to lay the power down and come together as bodies of women of South Africa that are saying this is what we need to do. So there's that I've heard being said. But as we do that, that we do not lose our imagination, because what we are feeling, we are saying, Comrade Vanessa and Jackie, the poet, and Unati, I think, have reminded us that it's not a fantasy, but it's actually a reality whose time has come. The feminist government has arrived. Fatima is saying, yes, it has arrived, but we're not going to build it in 2 weeks. We need to pace ourselves. And Vanessa says we then need a vision. We need a vision. We need a feminist. Fatima agrees to say we've never actually had a time as the women of South Africa to sit together and put together this feminist vision. As much as we've always spoken about the women's movement, Fatima, about the Women's Coalition, and we're saying some of the mistakes that happened there, that we really never had time to sit and just say, okay, we are here now, this is our vision. So COVID-19 has taken us back to that moment to say, let us not allow our differences to separate us, but let's write down our vision. And after this meeting, that's what we must do. And that vision is going to take us to our immediate term and to our long term. And recognize the fact that even as we do the short-term work, we are already in the process of building. So COVID-19 is not just a collapse, because when something collapses, something is being born, something is being rebuilt, but it's not going to happen all the time. So let us be mindful of pace, because people say to us, when we run the way that we run, we also forget small little things like taking care of each other and our health and our loved ones and so on, and yet we need each other. So one of the other things then, just in terms of capital itself, Pindi has also said, started in fact by this question that says, are feminist donors thinking like the pandemic, right? Are feminist, I mean, not feminist donors, but actually is the money environment and the donor environment thinking like the moment? Because if it is not setting itself into this imagination, into this moment, then it is left behind, and it is therefore not able to fund the moment. It is not able to fund like the way the pandemic is doing. And Pindi says the pandemic is chaotic. It has placed all of us in different places. And I think Nikki has said, yes, we see that, and we need to then allow ourselves to be renamed, you know, as the donor space. And that renaming means that you need to be able to fund the undocumented movement builders. And there's many of us who are undocumented movement builders. So, you know, in the manner that the capitalist arrangements of funding have made us invisible, not deliberately so, because I think the admission also from Comrade Fatima and Comrade Uniki is that as much as we can see the collapse of the capitalist system within the donor environment, capitalism itself is very resilient as a system. We've seen it coming back into so we must not be blinded by the fact that it has got that kind of resilience. So even in the strategies that we put in place in building this feminist government, as we write down this vision that has arrived, we must be very deliberate and very mindful about that resilience and how we work with that. That resilience is sitting in all our bodies also. Because we are part of the system has also created us. So it means we unlearn also certain patterns of living, certain ways of doing things, and our relationship with money becomes a different thing. That's where Pindi comes in and says our relationships matter also, and other and lastly, then Vanessa says to us, Let us not then, in all of that doing, be afraid of power. Let's not be afraid of taking the power back. We must say what we want. We are very, very clear. We want power, and we don't see that wanting as a bad. Jackie also agrees to say we want that power and that power because we want to change things. We want to change our lives. We need to lead. Power is not necessarily a bad thing. And that power is the power to govern. We need a feminist government. We need a feminist government, and the feminist government has arrived, and the feminist government is now. So it is then rebuilding this feminist future in that way. There are many things then that we have said, the capitalist history does not have objective meaning. So some of the things are not going to make sense, And lastly, I think is what you said, Fatima, the narrative then becomes key. Because there's going to be a lot of meaninglessness. And one of the mistakes of the women's movement, the women's coalition, was not to deliberately build the narrative. And that is the responsibility of the intellectual capital that sits in all of us, to say, even as we have these conversations, let us deliberately create these conversations that build the narrative of the moment, to say what time is it, so that we don't spend our time just responding to GPV, just making food parcels, which is necessary for the moment because that is the way of taking care of each other. But that is that we don't lose the moments and the times to build a narrative. And I just want to bring this also in closing. We will definitely close in the next 5 minutes if there are no other reflections. I was also listening to Tsitsi Dangarembo yesterday and the comrades in Zimbabwe, reflecting on the very same questions that we are reflecting on. It says to us the challenge of the women's organizing in Zimbabwe and generally in Southern Africa has been that blindedness, which was not necessarily blindedness, but it's also because the system itself does not recognize us as citizens. Democracy is structured. It refuses to see us as citizens, even though it makes us feel ourselves as citizens, but we are not, because we are not able to speak in this narrative that is democracy. So we need to then rename ourselves, and that renaming is in the narrative. And the narrative means we write things down. It means that we tap into our intellectual energy, and that intellectual energy does not sit with people with PhDs and masters and so on. And that's a lie that we have been told. But that intellectual capital sits in all of us, in all the spaces that we occupy, the different ways of learning, the different ways of organizing that we've been doing over the years, that we tap into that and write it down. And I think that's the vision that Vanessa is speaking about. And perhaps if we come back here next time, hopefully we would have some forms of some drafts of that vision so that we can visualize it and say, this is our draft vision. We can spend some time as we take care of each other during the pandemic so that we don't die, building that vision and building that into a form that we can visualize. So those are my reflections, and I know I haven't done justice to this beautiful conversation to pick up everything, but I was just picking things that I'm hearing. So I'm going to open up in the last 3 to 6 minutes that we have left for close up comments from the chat room, from you, Fatima, and from you, Pindi, and then we will say goodbye.
I want to say, Fikile, from my side, really nothing to add. I just want to say, I really think it's important for us to have this conversation. It shouldn't be a once-off, so we should open the space for many voices so that we can, I think, be challenged in terms of the things we're thinking about. But I agree with you, Fikile, we should make this road while we are walking. I don't think we can wait until we have a comprehensive vision before we start actioning it. So maybe one of the practical things we should do is to start noting what are some of the concrete suggestions that are coming out of these conversations. From today, I definitely think there's a donor conversation to be had, but I think it would be important for us to be organized and be clear about what the conversation is before we convene it. So I think it's a wonderful space to think aloud. I had a terrible week, so it's just a wonderful way to end my work week. Thank you, sisters. I just don't want the practical action to go lost as well. So I think we must find the balance between having this space where we think aloud together and starting to do things at the same time.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Fatima. And also just to close by saying that there's 6 of us in the room and there's 60 more other of us out there and 600 more others of, who could have been here, but also because of the very same conversation we are having, which is capital and resource, we're not able to bring everyone in the room. So there's also something to think about, to say, as we stay in this conversation, how do we at least enable that continent to take its course with the resources that we are, in smaller ways, that would really be appreciated. I don't see any other comments from the chat room. Let me check the chat. I don't see hands. Just gonna wind up from the chat. Okay, someone says, okay, I don't want to miss everyone. I'm just going up a little bit. Okay, so somebody is saying, I agree, Nikki, a coming together strategy is definitely the way to go. So this is an agreement with what Nikki was saying earlier on. And we can see Constance from Asijiri, you've joined us, you're welcome. And Zugiswa says we really need to heal, because if we are still in bandages of all these struggles and diseases and we're not talking about them, it's really a problem. So it's about time and that we have spaces where we feminists can belong and distress. I agree with you, Zugis. When Jackie the Poet says we definitely want a feminist revolution in a government unapologetically. And someone, Zugisa says, I agree with you, Nikki. A coming together strategy is definitely a way to go. We have to work on that strategy. And Onati had to leave us, says I'll have to leave because I have a family meeting. Thank you so much for joining us, Onati. We know we're all stretching ourselves between different demands of COVID-19 in our lives. Thank you for being here. Zugisa says, because we are different and things that we do are different, but coming together is where we become each other's keeper, and to pay more attention towards our struggles as feminists is very, very important at this time. I think, Fatima, that's what you were saying. That's actually the immediate goal, and we just lay down really our power. We flatten it, we flatten the structure, because the structure is so full of power. Let's flatten it and just be ourselves. Vanessa says, can we fund women's economic empowerment programs, please, in an ecologically sustainable way that builds people's power outside and beyond these hierarchical NGOs? And it's all the power, the thing I was also talking about, to say, can you please find a way of funding outside of the NGO arrangement? Because that's where the majority of movement builders live. Movement types, structures we have at present. So, and can these programs then fund radical feminist political organizing? So that's the question that I equally share, Comrade Vanessa. Thank you so much. Constance says, thank you so much, Spigula. I totally agree with you. Nikki also, please, not to be donor-driven movements. So she was, Colin is really supporting what Nikki was saying there, to say donors don't need to see themselves as builders, but they need to fund the builders. So Constance is happy about that input from Nikki. Nikki says, I think out of this conversation, we begin to work towards this women's movement in a real and practical way. Absolutely, Nikki, we need to do that. We need to come back into this conversation, and hopefully when we come back next time, we'll have some practical ideas in terms of what we're doing. And Vanessa was saying to Fatima, this is not a fantasy, it's actually a real vision. I think Jackie said that as well. I said that too. Zugiswa says, is it possible for us to get the recording of this meeting, colleagues? Yes, it is a resource for all of us. It is available on YouTube, and we will circulate it as well. If anyone wants a Zoom version of it, it's always available. Please just let us know. Because we always will share it in the spaces that we can, but not everyone sits in those spaces as well. Heidi says, this discussion is being live streamed on YouTube. Yes, so you were responding to that. Absolutely, Nikki, agreed. Unati says, thank you all. It was a great conversation. I have to go now. Zubisa says, I'd like to be part of these meetings. Please, here is my email. Definitely Zubisa will keep you in the conversation. Zubisa is coming from Sweat. And it's just thank yous from Tuli. Heidi, here is there's too much noise in the background. Okay, that was just about the noise coming up. So anyway, Tuli says, I'm really drawn to the notion of the feminist economic building at this time, the whole idea of building the economy, because rightfully so, you said that this is an economic war. There is a war going on, and it is economic, and it requires economic solutions. Vanessa said very clearly that if this feminist vision is not anti-capitalist, it's not going to be radical enough to change things. Yes, you want to say something, Fatima?
Yeah, sorry, I know we are very few left on the call, Fikile, but what I wanted to, I just think about it, no? In some parts of the world, people have communal kitchens where they eat together. So if you look in the Basque region, there are women who pool resources, they eat together, and then people eat communally. So one of the possibilities we should think about creatively is how do we use the soup kitchens to transform it in a post-COVID context to possibly creating communal kitchens in poor communities where people establish purchasing cooperatives, so buy things together, cook together, eat together. That is not a form of charity where someone's feeding you, but it's actually people who come together and build an economy around eating together. So I think part of what we have to do is see what is the infrastructure that COVID leaves us around women's self-organization and how do we build on that. I don't know how the detail would work, but I'm saying it as something for us to think about, possibly to continue in our next conversation.
Sure. Thanks, Fatima. I realize that power may leave you also because of load shedding. Thank you so much for your time. If you feel you need to exit, please do so gracefully. And Jackie says, thank you, Fatima, very, very much before you leave. Thank you, Fix, for organizing. You're welcome, Jackie the Poet. Thank you to Heidi and the media team that has put all of this fantastic work together. Violette too, we thank you so much. We appreciate you. Thank you, Jackie the Poet, for your leadership. Jackie the Poet does an amazing work behind the scenes to make this work happen. We appreciate your time, your generosity, and thanks to you, Pindi, as well for sharing your time with us, even though it was hard because of load shedding. We appreciate you. Sisters, we love each other. This is a love revolution, and this is where it ends today, to be continued next time. Thank you so, so much, everyone. Love and light.
Thank you so much, Vic. Long time. Thank you, Jackie. Thanks, Fatima.
Yeah, those who want to chat, thank you. Anyone who wants to chat, for those who are still here, you can open your video, you can chat, it's fine until you're feeling like you want to leave. Thank you, Pindi.
Thank you, beloved.
Bye.